Seeing as we're filming down by the sea again, because that's one of our favourite places to film, and we just had lunch in one of our most favourite beachside cafes, the Bluebird, I just thought of something which I'd like to show you. It's a technique which involves thinking through the different things that your camera can do. Now, we've already looked at things like focal lengths and shutter speeds and apertures and all that kind of stuff. So this is more of an exercise in what happens when you combine some of these things in different ways. What will the picture look like? It's a bit creative, this one, and I'm winging it because I've sort of thought this up on the spur of the moment. So we've got this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful little old Morris Minor van, Morris Jelly Mould we used to call them, because they look like you should have filled them up with jelly and turned them out on a plate and it'd all wobble and everything. It'd be brilliant. If this was in a slightly more interesting environment, the shot would probably work better. I kind of like the front of it, I like the shape of it, I like the symmetry of the front of cars. This particular technique, which I'm going to show you, works particularly well with cars. If I was to just take a picture of the front of the car, it's going to look like this. It's a nice enough picture of the front of a car. The environment isn't particularly brilliant, but what I want to do is to get you thinking about what would happen if we change the focal length of the lens during the exposure. It's called a zoom blur. So we're going to zoom the lens whilst the shutter is open. Then the shutter will close and the exposure is recorded. Think about it for a minute. What's going to happen? There's going to be a sense of movement, isn't there? Although the car isn't moving, and although my camera won't be moving, because you've got to do this really on a tripod to make this work properly. You don't want the camera or the subject to move for this to work. So what are we going to do? In order for me to be able to zoom my lens a little bit during an exposure, I've obviously got to have a fairly slow exposure. If I've got an exposure of a 500th of a second, the chance of me being able to sort of zoom during that exposure, okay, I could do it, but the shutter speed's so fast it will freeze that movement. We want to create a little bit of a blur. So I've kind of done some of the Blue Petery work for you by setting the camera up on the tripod now. If I look through the viewfinder, the first thing to do is to compose the shot. This works best with some symmetry. If we just have a look at this picture here without doing anything, we've got the car sat nicely in the frame, we've got, you know, equal spaces going on all around, and the Morris Minor badge is really smack in the middle of the viewfinder. It's a bit of a focal point. Let's have a look at this shutter speed. How are we going to get that shutter speed slow? Because it's a fairly bright day. And if I just look through my viewfinder, using an average aperture of f5, I've got a 320th of a second. So I need to get that really, really slow. The place to go there would be, let's have a look and see what my ISO's doing. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive the camera is, the slower the shutter speed you can use. Well, I'm on 200 ISO, which is the lowest ISO I can set on this camera without going into some of the digitally settings. I don't like doing that. How else can I make the light level cut down so the shutter speed will get slower to compensate for it? Well, I can make the aperture smaller, can't I? So right now I'm on f5, so let's dial in a much, much smaller aperture. Let's go to f22. There we go. Right, so at f22, in this light, and the sun's just this minute gone down, I've got a 13th of a second. But I would like it to be a bit slower. I'm not quite sure how slow. This is very much about drawing on your experience, about playing with all these different things we talk about in all the different films and getting used to what they do. And then through experience, you can start to block them together. I need less light so I can make that shutter speed slower. Somewhere around a quarter would be nice if I can. Well, you can add a neutral density filter. You've got to put something on the lens to remove some light. I'm just going to use a polarizing filter. A polarizing filter will remove about 2 stops of light. So let's just pop the, if I can get it off, the trusty lens hood off. Pop the polarizing filter on there. I'm not necessarily using the polarizing effect of the polarizing filter, I'm just using it to cut down light. You could use a neutral density filter, it's just I'm being lazy, I've got a polarizer in my pocket, so that's what I'm using. Now let's have a look. Excellent, my shutter speed has now dropped to 1/4 of a second. That's great, that's quite a slow shutter speed. You've got to do this on a tripod because at that sort of slowness of shutter speed, you're going to really get camera shake if you try and hold it in your hand. You want the camera to be steady and you want the subject to be steady. What we're going to do is zoom the lens a little tiny bit during the exposure. The more you zoom the lens, the more this zoom blur effect, which you haven't seen yet, will happen. Let's have a look. You've seen a picture with nothing going on. I'm at 24mm. To fill the kind of frame with the front of the car, I only need to go to 50mm. So let's have a little go at an exposure where I'm going to change the focal length from 24 to 50mm during it. I don't have to look through the camera because the camera's locked on a tripod. I can look at the barrel of my lens and watch my zoom. So I'm going to press the shutter, there we go, and I zoom just that little bit during the exposure. You can see we've got movement going on, haven't we? It looks as though everything's moving. The front of the van is sort of fairly sharp and there's sort of movement around it. It's quite a surreal, ghostly little effect. Let's try another one. Let's just see. Now at that time I zoomed in. They work equally well zooming out. I'm going to go in tight on the van. This time we'll go from 50 and take it out to 24. There we go. Look at that, massive amount of zoom blur going on in that one. And as you experiment with it, you can start to get these really nice effects. Now in this particular shot, it would be better if we didn't have the beach hut to the right and possibly the trees over the top. But I hope you're getting my idea as to why this looks so good. Let me try another. I didn't zoom quite so much that time. That looks really nice, that looks really cool. I'll try another zooming back out. You can do it through the viewfinder, but I want you to get used to not looking through the viewfinder and considering what's going on. This time we're going 24-35. It's only a 10mm zoom. There it is. That looks really nice. So why is it doing it? The shutter is opening and the focal length is changing. If you just look through the viewfinder and turn the zoom ring a bit, things get closer, don't they? Although nothing is physically moving, the optics of the lens are making it appear to move. So the shutter is opening and that appearance of movement is then recording onto your camera's sensor and then the shutter is closing. And you can get these really cool effects. It works quite well with things like, I don't know, anything really that's symmetrical, but you do need a central point in the picture to sort of fix it, which is why I used the little badge in the front of the car there. So what I suggest you do, there's the little badge, what I suggest you do is, I wasn't quick enough for Jane's camera work, what I suggest you do is get yourself off out somewhere. If you can go to somewhere like a Maserati dealership and they'll let you do it, go and have a little experiment, have a little practice on the front of cars. I find cars work well because you've always got this symmetry of headlights and grille, etc. going on. You can get some really, really, really interesting pictures. You can do it with people as well. You could do this with a portrait, but you need to make sure that person's face is in the middle of the frame. Now this is contrary to everything I keep going on about composition, but you could put someone's face in the middle, run the zoom blur effect so that their face is the sharpest part of the picture, and then crop it afterwards so that if you don't want them in the middle, you could kind of put them off to one side or use them on a third and you've still got that blur effect. I hope that was fun. Get your zoom lens out and go and have a play. And don't forget, you don't have to use a monster zoom. I was only zooming by a maximum of 25mm there, both in and out. Whoops, I've just realised I forgot to tell you something. Whilst I was doing that, I was shooting in aperture priority mode. The reason I'm telling you which mode it is that I use is because I know I'm going to get emails saying which mode did you use. It doesn't matter which mode you use. If you want to shoot manually, just remember that whole thing about reducing the size of your aperture, cuts down light, so you have to extend the length of your shutter speed. Shutter priority isn't the best one to use, even though it may seem to be, because common sense would dictate you set 1/4 of a second shutter speed and the camera will do the rest for you. But it might not, because if the light levels are too bright, it won't be able to get a small enough aperture to cut the light down sufficiently. My preferred method is to use aperture priority, because then I can set the camera's smallest aperture, and then I know it will always give me its slowest shutter speed, regardless. Plus, if the light level goes up and down whilst we're shooting, the camera will compensate for it with the shutter speed. These are little things you just have to juggle. So I apologise there, I forgot to mention, I was using aperture priority, but I would suggest aperture or manual mode are the best ones to use to do this. The key is a slow enough shutter speed that you can see the whole of your short zoom blur during the exposure.